I'm the president and CEO of the Hutchinson-Reno County Chamber of Commerce, and we are very thankful for you all coming out tonight. We're also very appreciative of some of our business partners that have helped sponsor this event, namely the Hutchinson getting tongue-tied there, Hutchinson Regional Healthcare System, and all of their subsidiaries. They are a great sponsor of this event. I also want to remind you that the Chamber does not endorse candidates, and we've had some questions about that. The Kansas Chamber has indeed endorsed candidates, but the Hutchinson-Reno County Chamber does not endorse candidates, and I just wanted to make that very clear. It's part of our mission to organize opportunities like this for our business leaders and members in the community to learn about the policy issues and interact with these elected officials and those seeking office. We, as I said, just concluded the Reno County Commission 1st District race debate, and we will now hear from the candidates for the Kansas House of Representatives 104th District. Following this, at 5:30, we will hear from the Republican candidates for Kansas Governor. The format for the forum, I'll restate that as we stated it earlier for the earlier session. We will begin with a 2-minute opening statement from each candidate, and at the end of the forum, we will also conclude with 2-minute closing remarks from each candidate. Meanwhile, the questions from our panelists will be asked, and each candidate will have 1 minute to respond. The first candidate to respond to each question will then have 30 seconds for a rebuttal response. We estimate that we're going to have time for about 6 to 7 questions. To keep the candidates on time, Leanne Cox, the Vice President of the Chamber, will be down in front. She'll be timing the responses, and she will hold up a white 15-second card to remind the candidates of their remaining time. And then when time is up, she will ring a bell. The bell is kind of hard to hear, so I may have to sometimes chime in and close off the remarks at the 1-minute reminder. Questions this evening will be asked by our panelists that you see here on stage left. On the very left, we have Ron Sylvester, the editor with the Hutchinson News, followed by Mr. Fred Goff, news director with Eagle Radio, and Mr. Cliff Shank, owner of Ad Astra per Aspera Broadcasting. They have prepared a battery of policy-based questions, and we have also had reader questions submitted via an email to the Hutch News. We'll be including some of those in the program tonight as well. I would now like to introduce the candidates that are joining us on stage this evening. First, we have Representative Steve Becker on the left. Representative Becker has held the office for Kansas House of Representatives District 104th District from 2013 to present. Prior to that, he served as judge for the Reno County District Court from 1981 to 2007. Next, we have Mr. Paul Waggoner on the right. Paul is general manager of Waggoners, Inc., a pew cushion and pew upholstery business. I've been out to tour his business, and I want to let you know that both of these gentlemen are members of the Hutchinson-Reno County Chamber. Mr. Waggoner is active with Reno County Republicans and a member of the class of 2017 Kansas Republican Men's Leadership Series. So we are very grateful for both of your participation this evening, and we look forward to the questions. So we will we'll begin next with opening statements from Mr. Steve Becker.
I'm going to try this standing up. Thank you to the local chamber. It's important to me that I distinguish between the local chamber and the state chamber. I thanks the local chamber as well as Hutchinson Regional Medical Center. I'd like to visit with you all, but I'm on the clock. What I'm going to try to do with my opening statement is give you a prologue, kind of set the stage that will be a context for the Q&A that we're about to begin. Because my answers, my responses are going to be influenced by my time in the legislature. So I start with legislative session 2012. I was not there, but legislative leaders and Governor Brownback orchestrated a huge gamble with the Kansas economy. They were going to make Kansas a no income tax state. If Florida and Texas can do it, we can do it, is what I heard over and over again. So what they did, and this was accompanied with grandiose promises of economic growth. They ripped the income tax leg off of the three-legged tax stool. And the idea was, before that stool could topple over, there would be so much economic growth and so much business that it would prop that stool and keep it steady. That didn't happen. The businesses didn't come, and we tried to fix the matter with sales tax. I voted against that. That didn't work. In 2017, we reinstated some of those cut taxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. We will, Leanne, I just want to make sure, was that a 2-minute? Okay. So next we will have 2-minute opening statements for Mr. Paul Waggoner.
I'll try and do this too, standing up, at least as far as the opening statement. It is truly an honor to be here this afternoon. To run for office for the legislature is not something to be taken lightly, and I haven't. I filed on June 1st with only 45 minutes left before the deadline in Topeka. And why? Because I am a Republican, a genuine Republican. I can't believe the Hutchinson News actually lets me write for them Republican. I bled red as a Republican, and if the Reno County Democrats had even 24 hours to respond, they would have ran someone against me. But the incumbent filed for re-election 8 months ago, and the Democrats just shrugged. I'm a businessman. I went to KU and came back after 10 years to this town. I love this town. It is a great place to live, and I raised my family here. My kids turned out all right, and not one of them ever lived in our basement. But we need opportunity in this town and in this state. The gross domestic product of Kansas was $158 billion last year. The state general fund budget is $7 billion. If you want progress, you look to grow that first number and not the second. Our incumbent is entrenched in Topeka with the vested interests and lobbyists. But if growing government is the answer, why has it not worked in Hutchinson? Look around you. We have plenty of nice new federal, city, county, or school buildings. But then look at the mall, or 30th and Plum, or 30th and Lorraine. The National Federation of Independent Business endorsed my candidacy as a challenger, which is unheard of in a primary. But they did it because I get it. I get it about regulations, about bureaucrats, about taxes and spending. I have a very practical bent. I don't go off on long, improbable quest or journey. The business world has a word for people who are pie in the sky with their promises. That word is broke. I do my research, I get my facts right, I care about looking out for the best interests of the 104th. In Sunday's newspaper, I said in my comments, a society that has a vibrant private economy and respects traditional values benefits everyone. That is why I'm here before you this day.
Thank you, Mr. Waggoner. All right, thank you both for your opening statements. We are ready for some questions from our panelists, and the first question is going to come from Mr. Fred Goff on policy issues.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. If you're fortunate enough to go to Topeka to be our representative in the 104th District, what issues would you like to work on and why?
Mr. Becker will take that question first.
I started with the opening statements, but
Okay.
that's okay.
You'll each get a chance. I'm going to go with my sheet for now. So, Mr. Becker, we'll let you go first.
Okay, thank you. We're going to continue working on some issues that we have previously worked on. We still need to wrap up school funding. We will be able to do that this next session. We received the Supreme Court opinion and telling us what we need to do, and we're going to do it. And I hope that will conclude what we all refer to as the Gannon case, and that we will finally adequately fund our public education. It is my hope that we get once again to address the Medicaid expansion, but that's going to depend on who the governor is. We addressed it last year. It passed. It was vetoed. We were 3 votes short of overriding the veto. So I think we'll take another try. Thank you.
Mr. Waggoner? Okay.
In going to the legislature in 2019, I would have a couple of priorities. The first would be to get a control on state spending as far as the trajectory of state spending. In the last 2 years, the budget has gone from just over $6.2 billion to almost $7 billion. That is an unsustainable increase in spending. Further, I would make it a priority to work on the kind of underlying problem with the budget is the fact that the state Supreme Court actually controls half of the state budget. The fact that the court has it and not the legislature takes away any sort of give and take, any sort of ability for nuance or for compromise, and I consider that a serious problem. I would also be looking as far as some of the efficiency studies that have been actually done, that nothing has been done with. The Alvarez study from 2 or 3 years ago, as far as a good example of ways to get a handle on spending.
Thank you both. We would now have an opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal from Mr. Becker.
We have implemented over 50 of the recommendations of the Alvarez study, and we're working on more. It's interesting that one of the recommendations of the Alvarez study is expand Medicaid. But no, we overlooked that. As far as the Supreme Court, if you take judicial oversight away from school funding will plummet. There is a contingent that does not support public education.
Thank you both for sharing those remarks, and thanks for sticking with my alternating first response. The next question will first be answered by Mr. Waggoner, followed by Mr. Becker, and that question is from Ron Sylvester, related to a very hot topic across the nation, actually.
Some of our questions were submitted by readers, and one of them are friends at the Fraternal Order of Police want to know, do you support the legalization of marijuana, and please elaborate on your answer.
I haven't given it a lot of thought, but my clear answer would be no as far as legalization. I mean, I know there's been movements as far as taking it, I think it's already been taken from being a felony down to a misdemeanor. I mean, there's some things that are decriminalization. I would say, frankly, in a very practical sense, I would base my answer on the fact that we actually have a place out in Colorado. And so we spend a certain amount of time in Colorado, and going to Colorado, you see the very negative effects of legalization of marijuana. As far as not only have you seen a very substantial increase in auto accidents related to people who are high on drugs, you have some peripheral crime. Just a mile from literally where we live, there was a big drug bust because you had, I think it was Colombian cartels were actually growing marijuana in Colorado to ship to Miami. And I think there's a lot more negatives than positives for legalization.
Mr. Becker, what's your response?
Thank you. When this issue comes up, I quickly distinguish between recreational marijuana and medicinal marijuana. I am not ready for recreational marijuana, and I don't think Kansas is ready for that. I take a different view on medicinal marijuana, and this is the reason. We have addressed this in the legislature, and conferees come to testify before the various committees, the health committee, and they will bring their children with them, and while they're testifying, the child will have like 12 seizures while the testimony was going on, and that could be stopped. That could be prevented with byproducts of marijuana for medicinal marijuana. When I see that we could relieve suffering of children, that's what reversed me. I did not always feel this way, but when I see that there's relief there for children, I think I would look very favorably at a properly drawn medicinal marijuana bill.
Mr. Waggoner, you have the opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal if you wish.
The question about medical marijuana, again, I take my reference to Colorado. You could go through Colorado, and all of the prescriptions, or a substantial percentage of the prescriptions for medical marijuana were all for people under the age of like 21. I mean, it had literally nothing to do with legitimate medical purposes. It was mostly just a ruse and sort of an entryway to actually legalizing marijuana. I think there's plenty of ways to manage pain that would be alternatives, and that's what I would search for.
Thank you both. The next question, we will allow Mr. Becker the first opportunity to answer, and that question is going to come from Cliff Shank on the topic of economic development.
What will you do to promote and improve economic development in the 104th District and the state of Kansas?
The best tool for economic development is educating our children. That's where it begins. That's the future of Kansas. But we also have programs available for agricultural economic growth, and that's what I think we need to focus on. That's what I would support, and in fact, I think it's called the Ad Astra program.
Good name.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a great economic program for rural development. It applies to the western two-thirds of the state, and it provides the benefits of bringing business to rural would be realized, would be paid when they produce benefits. It's not like giving them a tax write-off or giving them special interests when they first start up. They come in, we pay when they produce.
Mr. Waggoner, you have a 2-minute opportunity to respond to the question.
I guess I'll stand up as well. Mr. Becker actually has it backwards. The question, and I've seen it referenced to Johnson County, as far as that their strong school system is what made Johnson County prosperous, when actually it's just the opposite. It's the fact that Johnson County has a strong private economy is actually what runs their school system and makes it exceptional. I would say as far as on economic development, the main key is it's not really the big picture bringing in some company with 300 or 500 jobs that really matters. It's really what's happening on the grassroots with your average businesses, whether they're having to deal with bureaucrats and regulations, whether the tax policies disincentivize investment or whether they actually encourage it. It's a statistical fact that states that have a lower regulation and lower taxes have a higher rate of economic growth. You're going to grow the economy from a broad base, not from just a few projects that make it in the newspaper.
Mr. Becker, you have a 30-second opportunity to respond.
Very briefly, one of the things we accomplished this year is passing a bill allowing industrial hemp. I think that's going to be a huge thing for our agricultural economy. This year it's in a pilot program, and I hope it certainly develops. I think it will develop, and I think that will be have a big impact on agriculture economy. Thank you.
All right, the next question comes from Fred Goff, and that is related to taxation policy, and this one will be answered first by Mr. Waggoner.
Well, with the legislature raising taxes to cover state budget costs, and are there any places in the budget you would cut to allow taxes to be lowered, especially for working families in the area?
Fred, I think that the tax proposal that was passed in 27 had a couple of kind of glaring flaws. The first of which is, well, that was not addressed by the legislature is the fact that it has not been adjusted for the changes in the federal tax bill, which has changed the deductions, which effectively has raised personal income taxes about another $100 million, to be sure. The other aspect I would say is where the taxes, they lowered the threshold. Instead of $12,000 before taxation kicked in on the income tax, it was $6,000, which actually I thought was rather unfair for working class families. As far as going forward, the basic thing you want with taxation policy is, a flatter tax, a fairer tax, a more broad-based tax is what's going to generate the most income down the road. Tax income this year exceeded over $7 billion, which is greater than spending. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waggoner. Mr. Becker, what is your response?
Thank you. Talking about further cuts, that's why I kind of started with that overview. That's what we've been doing since 2012, is cutting services to you. At one point, the governor was prepared, I think some of you remember, at one point the governor was prepared to take the tobacco settlement agreement and sell it to a payday loan office, get a lump sum payment, and use it to pay bills. He's going to do something that drastic when there's more cuts available? I don't think so. We quit adequately funding schools. You'd think we'd fund schools if we could finance it with cuts. There are other things. We chose not to make a CAPERS payment, for goodness sakes. The state pays its contribution to CAPERS quarterly. We chose not to make one because we didn't have the money. Do you think we'd do that if there were cuts available?
Mr. Waggoner, you have a 30-second opportunity to respond to that.
Thank you. Mr. Becker avoids the fact that because of the state Supreme Court, that most of the increase that has happened in the state budget, which has been substantial in the last 2 years, has been directed to education. That the state of Kansas has multiple responsibilities, not only including the higher education, it also has Medicaid, it has other issues that if you bracket off half the budget and say any changes have to happen in the other half because the other is sacrosanct, you have actually set yourself up for disaster.
All right. Thank you both for your response on that. Now, the next question is going to come from Mr. Ron Sylvester, and this one is, I think, another reader question. Ron?
Well, yeah, and we're going to continue to talk about the budget a little bit. The hundreds of millions of dollars have been diverted from the highway program in order to pay the base budget. Is this appropriate, and how would you deal with it?
Mr. Becker?
No, it's not appropriate, but we had to pay bills. And it had a tremendous effect, not funding the Department of Transportation as it should have been funded. Projects were postponed. Maintenance on roads were postponed dramatically. And Kansas ranks very high in having the best highways in the nation, and we need to make sure we maintain that. This year, the budget this year, 2018, we did some things, and one of them was we returned. It was like paying restitution for thieving the funds from the KDOT. We returned funds to the KDOT, and we took a step in the right direction there. So, no, we used KDOT's money for many, many years.
Mr. Waggoner, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I think it's very inappropriate to take highway funds and divert them. Again, the question is you have to have spending under control to balance your spending with your taxation. I would secondarily say that Mr. Becker totally has his facts wrong. I wrote on this topic like 2 years ago that the story about how the state of Kansas, that the number of roads being maintained had dropped from 1,200 miles to 200 miles was actually a myth. That if you actually look at the actual data from the Department of Transportation, their budget has been right in the $1.3, $1.4 billion for the last 4 or 5 years. It was just, there's a difference between somebody who can only listen to a lobbyist and take what they say as being truth versus somebody who actually does actual research. Mr. Becker is the former, I am the latter.
Mr. Becker, Mr. Becker, you have a 30-second rebuttal to
I didn't
that.
understand the last comment, so I can't respond to it. But I think my opponent needs to do some more research. And the cuts he is suggesting, we finance the state with cuts. Is he suggesting we then start cutting KDOT again? No, we got to finance KDOT so they can provide services to you and me.
All right, the next question comes from Mr. Cliff Shank. Cliff?
This topic has been kicked around between the two of you, so it's going to give you a little bit more time to answer the question directly. Are you in favor of a constitutional amendment getting the Kansas Supreme Court out of school funding issues and allowing school districts to sue the state of Kansas every year?
Mr. Waggoner, this is your question
Oh,
first.
I start. Okay. Oh, this is an easy one. Of course I do. The question of a Supreme Court making decisions about school financing has been considered in multiple states, and in the vast majority of times, the state Supreme Court shows judicial restraint and actually refrains from interjecting themselves. You literally have the cases of the state of South Dakota and the state of Texas who have identical language to the Kansas Constitution about suitable funding for education, and they both punted on it, saying that this was not something, if they got involved with it, it's going to cause more trouble than it is worth, or it's going to create all sorts of issues. Further, I think it is inappropriate that school districts be allowed to sue. It's effectively the taxpayers suing the taxpayers. I would think, barring the fact, given the fact that it's so hard to get a constitutional amendment, you'd have to get it through the legislature with 2/3 vote. I think that would be a nice backstop to restraining school districts from their folly.
Mr. Becker, you have a 1-minute opportunity to respond to the question.
We touched on it earlier. Yes, the Kansas Constitution has the provision that the legislature shall provide suitable provision for funding of our schools. Do you really want that provision removed? So the legislature doesn't have a responsibility to provide funding for our schools. Is that what you really want? Again, I mentioned that there are legislators who do not support public education, and if there's no judicial oversight, if we remove the judiciary from looking at this, there's no safeguards. There's no safeguards, and as I mentioned earlier this evening, school funding would plummet. There would be no access to the courts, and there you have it. We cannot deny access to the courts.
We'll now allow for a 30-second response from Mr. Waggoner.
Yes, this is very easy. Mr. Becker, given the fact that most other states, the state Supreme Court has ruled that they are not supposed to legislate, are not supposed to intervene on this, you have all these surrounding states, many of which actually spend more than we do on public education, which basically refutes your whole point that somehow that funding would drop. It would be a legislative decision. It would be something the voters control by who they elect as representatives. Case closed.
It is now 5:13, and we want to allow each of the candidates a 2-minute closing statement. And in the alternating fashion, Mr. Becker will go first with his closing statement of 2 minutes. Yes.
I go first.
Yes.
Okay, I think everyone knows how embedded I am into the 104th fourth district, and I hope you understand that I am responsive to this district, and that's why the larger organizations, some that make endorsements, don't like that, don't like me. They don't like independent thought, and they don't like responsiveness to your particular district. I've done some good things for this community while I've been in Topeka. I had the opportunity to help Tech with some developmentally and intellectually disabled persons. I embraced the early education and fought fiercely to keep the funding away from our governor, who was just going to sell it for, put it in the SGF. Here recently, I played a role. I played a role in the state fair issue. I carried an amendment that will keep funding in the state fair for years to come, and that's going to help keep it here in Hutchinson. I have done a lot for this community. I am responsive. One other thing I wanted to mention is I have embraced the teachers, my teachers of this district, and have fought for them in the state legislature. I think it's important to understand that sharing the stage with me this evening is the Kansas Chamber, Americans for Prosperity, the Brothers Koch. That's who is sitting at the table.
Thank you, Mr. Becker.
That's strong enough.
All right, it is now 5:15, and we want to allow Mr. Waggoner his full 2 minutes for his closing remarks. Mr. Waggoner.
The only Coke I know is Diet Coke. Thank you all for your attention to what has been said here in this candidate debate. I think it is easy to see that there is a lot of differences between myself and Mr. Becker. In many ways, we are politically opposites. Sometimes I think it is a miracle that we were even in the same party, and I mean that literally. I know how the 104th House District votes when you have had a chance to express yourself directly on moral questions or values. I have been on your doorsteps and talked with many of you one-on-one. I know your values are not represented now in Topeka. In vote after vote, Mr. Becker sides with his favorite liberal social issue groups, no matter how intolerant their position is of authentic conservative values. Mr. Becker patted himself on the back for voting for the state's biggest tax increase with not even a dollar of cuts or efficiencies found on the spending side. No private business in a budget bind would ever think that they could not squeeze more value from their current resources. I not only stand for our First Amendment rights of conscience, speech, and religion, our Second Amendment rights, and the right to life, but I know how to think and analyze. Over the year, I've already gone toe-to-toe in print with the editors of the news. I know how to tell, very nicely, the powers that be that the emperor has no clothes. Topeka may not be the swamp that Washington, D.C. is, but it is surely a marshland, and Mr. Becker's boots are frankly wet and soggy. But even worse to the voters is the fact that his boots are pointed in the wrong direction. Where he keeps walking left, I say we need to go right. A vote for Waggoner is a vote to return to solid ground, for solid principles, for genuine, authentic conservative values. We need change in Topeka. To get there, we need change in the 104th. Please vote August 7th for that change. Vote Waggoner on the Republican ballot. Thank you. Thank you.
And with that, I thank both of you gentlemen very much for sharing your thoughts with us this evening. I want to thank the panelists that came up with a great battery of questions. I also, again, want to thank Hutchinson Regional Healthcare System for their sponsorship of this event. And so we are going to reconvene here at 5:30 p.m. with our gubernatorial candidates, and we'll be resetting the stage. We'll take a short intermission. Let's give another round of applause for these two candidates who have given of their time.